March 9th. Incendiary, Northfield, Tinian Island, Mariana Islands. The coral runway is still warm from the day, but the night air carries a damp, metallic bite. Floodlights wash the flight line in harsh white, turning rows of B-29 super fortresses into hulking shadows with silver bellies. Engines cough, then catch a deep, rolling thunder that never quite settles, like a storm refusing to move on. On the tarmac, Technical Sergeant Frank Red O'Hara, a flight engineer with the 73rd Bombardment Wing, presses a gloved hand to the cold aluminum skin of his aircraft. He can feel the vibration before the props even reach full speed. Crewmen move with practiced urgency checklists, shouted hand signals, fuel caps slammed shut. An ordnance team wipes sweat from their faces as they finish loading incendiary clusters into the bomb bays. Red looks up at the black sky and tries not to think about Tokyo as a city. He tries to think of it as a grid, a target, a set of coordinates. Inside the briefing hut earlier that evening, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and fatigue. Men who had flown daylight missions at 25,000 to Trenta. 000 feet missions ruined by high winds, scattered bomb patterns, and frustratingly small results sat shoulder to shoulder, staring at a map of Japan pinned to plywood. At the front stood Major General Curtis LeMay, jaw set, voice flat, the tone of a man who had decided something and dared the world to argue. "Tonight we go in low," he said. No flourish. No inspirational speech, just a change to the rules that had governed their survival. Low meant 5, 0, 0, 0, to Nove. 000 feet so low that the crews would feel Japan beneath them rather than floating above it. It meant night. It meant incendiaries, not the big, high-explosive bombs some of the airmen trusted, but hundreds of smaller weapons designed to start fires faster than a city could stop them. And it meant something else, something that hit the crews like a quiet punch, guns removed. Not all of them, but many. Less weight, more fuel efficiency, more bomb load. LeMay believed the Japanese night fighter threat was limited compared to what the B-29S had faced over Europe, and he wanted the aircraft to carry as much fire as possible. To a crewman like Red, that decision felt like standing in the open and trusting the darkness to be kind. After the briefing, Red returned to his aircraft and found his pilot, Captain James Jim McKenna, alone in the cockpit, staring at the instrument panel as if it might change its mind. Jim didn't look up when Red climbed in. "They want us down where you can smell the place." Red tried for humor. "Maybe we'll get a better view." Jim finally glanced over. His eyes had that exhausted shine that meant he'd already played the worst possibilities in his head. A better view of what happens if we're hit. The crew called their B-29 Lady Marian, a superstition that naming a machine made it more human, more loyal. She had the hallmark features that made the superfortress both admired and feared: pressurization, remote gun turrets, massive fuel capacity, and those temperamental Wright R-3350 engines, powerful, complicated, and capable of turning a mission into a fight just to stay airborne. Red ran the checklist like a prayer. Fuel boost pumps on, cowl flaps set, oil pressure steady. Outside, the ground crew chief leaned in and shouted over the engine roar, giving a thumbs up. The prop wash hammered the air, blasting coral dust across the line. The smell of gasoline, exhaust, and hot metal clung to everything. You can almost feel the tension in their routines, the way every motion is too precise, too practiced. Men don't move like that when they're calm. They move like that when calm has been replaced by discipline. At Chapter Sprezet Trezet Shichinj, the first B-29 of the strike force lifted off into the dark, climbing over the Pacific like a loaded freight train leaving a station. Lady Marian rolled next. Jim eased the throttles forward, and the aircraft surged. Heavy and reluctant, Red watched manifold pressure and engine temps. eyes flicking between gauges, listening for any note in the roar that sounded wrong. The runway lights blurred past. "Come on," Jim muttered, almost to the airplane. "Come on." The B-29 finally broke free, wheels lifting, the island dropping away beneath them. For a moment, the aircraft seemed to hover between worlds, between safety and whatever waited at the far end of the ocean. Once they formed up, the bombers did not gather into tight daylight formations. This was different, a stream of aircraft, each navigating its own route and timing to arrive over Tokyo in the planned sequence. No sunlight, no gleaming silver boxes in the sky, only navigation lights blinking faintly, then disappearing. Hours passed in the dark. The Pacific looked like a sheet of ink. The cockpit was a dim cave of red instrument glow and quiet. Clipped voices. The navigator called out fixes. The radio operator listened to static and brief transmissions. Red monitored engines, watching temperatures like a hawk. The aircraft felt strangely exposed without the familiar sense of altitude, a psychological armor they were about to discard. Somewhere ahead, Tokyo waited wooden neighborhoods, narrow streets, paper walls, civilian shelters, factories stitched into residential blocks, and above it all, Japan's air defense's searchlights, flak batteries, and the few night fighters that could climb high enough and find them in the black. Near the Japanese coast, the air changed. The horizon became something other than emptiness. Jim leaned forward, scanning. "We'll be in soon." Red swallowed, adjusting a valve. He could hear his own breathing in his headset. Then came the words that meant the plan was about to become reality. An instruction passed through the cockpit like an electrical current. "Prepare for low-level run." LeMay's decision wasn't just a tactic. It was a gamble that would turn an entire city into a test of what modern air power could do when it stopped trying to be precise and started trying to be unstoppable. And in the darkness over Japan, the first distant flickers began to appear tiny, trembling points of light that hinted at what was about to ignite. The flickers grow as they descend, first like scattered lanterns, then like a dim orange smear along the horizon. Tokyo isn't visible yet, not as streets and landmarks, but as presence, a sprawling darkness that seems to breathe beneath the clouds. At 2330 local time, Lady Marion levels off lower than any of them have ever flown a B-29 over enemy territory. The altimeter needle sits where it shouldn't, just thousands of feet above the ground. Not tens of thousands. The aircraft feels heavier, louder, closer to everything. The engine's vibration comes through the airframe into Red's bones. The navigator, First Lieutenant Harold Sato Nisei, American-born. His voice, calm and precise, leans into his chart light. He calls out headings like he's reading a recipe. Course 085. We'll pick up the first marker fires at the IP. The marker fires are the key to the new method. Not a pinpoint aim point seen in daylight. Not a Norden bomb site myth. Tonight, the strike depends on pathfinders lighting the way, incendiary markers dropped to start controlled blazes that will guide the main force. The radio operator crackles. A short transmission comes through someone ahead reporting winds lighter than expected at low altitude. Red hears the exhale in Jim's silence. High-altitude winds over Japan have been a constant enemy, scattering bombs. Warping plans. If the winds are weaker down here, the bomb patterns will be tighter. The fire will spread where it's intended. But that also means they will be tighter in the sights of the gunners below. Tokyo's air defenses announce themselves as if offended by the audacity of it. Not a warning shot. Not a distant burst at altitude. But thick, angry flak that rises to meet them. Black puffs bloom in the night like poisonous flowers. Flak at 2 o'clock, the tail gunner calls. Voice sharp despite the reduced armament, even with some guns removed. They still have eyes in every direction, men trained to see death coming. Jim doesn't jink wildly. At this altitude, violent, evasive maneuvers can shred a formation, throw off a bomb run, or overstress an already burdened airframe. Instead, he makes small corrections, keeping the aircraft steady enough for the moment that matters. Red watches the engine temps climb slightly as Jim increases power to maintain speed and altitude in the turbulent air. He reaches for the cowl flap controls, adjusting by instinct. Outside, searchlights begin stabbing upward, white spears slicing through darkness. They don't catch Lady Marian yet, but they move like predators, probing, sweeping, hunting for aluminum skin. Then far ahead something changes the texture of the night. A glow, not a single fire, but a cluster of them, forming a rough shape on the ground. A triangle, a line, a pattern. The markers, Sato says, almost reverently. They're on. Those first fires are not accidents. They are deliberate signals, laid down by aircraft that went in before the mainstream pathfinders, whose job is to die early if that's what it takes to show the way. Red imagines them flying even lower, even closer, dropping the first incendiaries into a sea of black roofs. Tokyo begins to take form as the bomber stream arrives in waves. From above, you can see how the city is built to burn. Large districts are packed with wooden structures, narrow lanes, paper screens, and shared walls. The industrial heart of Tokyo isn't isolated on the edge, it's woven into neighborhoods. Small workshops and factories sit next to homes. The city is not a modern grid of fire breaks, it's a patchwork of fuel. Lady Marian approaches the initial point, the last navigation checkpoint before the bomb run. In the cockpit, voices tighten. Bomb bay doors in 2 minutes, Jim says. Red reaches for the switch panel and glances at the bombardier. Lieutenant Thomas Tommy Wells, lying prone behind the bomb sighting station. Tommy isn't using the old daylight technique. Tonight his job is simpler and more terrifying: release at the right moment over an area target designed to become one massive ignition. Tommy's voice comes through. Clipped. I have the fire pattern. I have the aiming box. The first real shock hits when they see the firewall beginning to form, flames licking upward, reflecting off smoke that piles into the sky. The glow illuminates rooftops, canals, streets. For the first time, the airmen can see civilians running tiny figures, darting like insects toward open spaces that may already be doomed. A burst of flak blooms close enough that Red feels the concussion through the fuselage. Jesus, someone mutters. Jim's knuckles are white on the yoke. Hold it steady. The bomb bay doors open with a mechanical groan. The plane shudders as if relieved to finally expose its burden. Red can hear it, wind tearing into the open bomb bay. A deep howl layered under the engine roar. The smell in the cockpit shifts slightly, as if the night air is carrying something foreign. Smoke, not yet choking, but present. Sato calls out the last heading correction. 10 degrees right. Steady. Steady. They fly into the outskirts of the fire zone. The heat begins to rise even to their altitude, an unnatural warmth. Like flying over a furnace, updrafts punch the aircraft, lifting one wing, then dropping the other. Red watches the airspeed fluctuate. This is the first moment you understand why low and slow is not the right phrase. At low altitude, the B-29 is not slow. It is a heavy machine being tossed by the weather it is creating. Bombs away. Tommy says. The aircraft jolts as the incendiary clusters release hundreds of small fire-starting weapons, spilling downward in a deadly rain. For a few seconds, Red imagines the view from below, the sky opening, metal canisters whistling, then bursting into burning fragments that cling to rooftops, crawl into attics, spread across wooden beams. The glow beneath them intensifies almost immediately, as if the city has been waiting for the excuse. Jim banks away, shallow at first, then tighter as flak brackets them. Searchlights snap toward the bomber stream. One beam catches a superfortress to their left, pinning it in white glare like a specimen. Flak erupts around it. Take it off, someone whispers, though no one can. The light holds. Then, as if the night itself flinches, the aircraft disappears into smoke and darkness. leaving only the sense that something terrible has just happened somewhere you can't confirm. Lady Marian pushes onward. Red keeps his eyes on the gauges. But the view outside is impossible to ignore now. Tokyo is no longer a target. It is becoming an event. Fires merge. Streets become channels of light. Smoke stacks upward into a growing column that spreads like a bruise across the sky. And beneath the bomber stream, the city begins to generate its own wind, air rushing toward the flames, feeding them, pulling oxygen from every direction. A crewman in the cockpit says quietly, almost like he's speaking in church, "It's making its own weather." Red doesn't answer. He can feel it in the turbulence, in the way the aircraft rises and falls, as if riding invisible waves. They have dropped their load. The mission should be turning into the long trip home. But now comes the part LeMay's plan cannot fully control: what happens when thousands of fires begin to link into one. Behind them, Tokyo is bright enough to read by, and the night over Japan starts to look less like darkness and more like a furnace door left open. The heat reaches them in pulses now, like invisible hands shoving at the wings. Even after turning away from the aiming area, Lady Marian keeps getting bumped upward by columns of rising air. Red tightens his grip on the edge of his engineer's panel, eyes flicking between cylinder head temperatures and manifold pressure. One engine needle trembles just slightly. Red leans closer. Number 3's running hot. Jim doesn't look away from the windscreen. "Can you cool it?" Red adjusts cowl flaps a fraction, feeds more airflow across the cylinders. The B-29 is designed for high altitude. Cold, thin air. Long, steady cruise. Down here, in thick, warm air full of smoke and turbulence. It feels like forcing a racehorse to run through a burning barn. Behind them, Tokyo's glow climbs the cloud base. The city is no longer dots of fire, it is a continuous sheet. An orange-white field that paints the underside of the night like daylight gone wrong. Far off the left wing, a line of bombers keeps coming in. Their navigation lights briefly visible before smoke swallows them. The strike is not one blow but many, layered and timed. Each wave adds fuel to something that is already feeding on itself. The tail gunner's voice cuts through. Fighters. 1 o'clock high no. Level. A shape slides through the darkness, faint silhouette. A flash of exhaust. Then gone. A Japanese night fighter, hunting by moonlight and firelight, trying to pick off bombers in the confusion. Lady Marian's remaining gunners track it. But the night swallows details. There's no clean, confident call, no bandit at 600 yards. Just instinct, fear, and the knowledge that at this altitude, a fighter has less time to climb, less room to maneuver, but a much easier target because the bombers are close enough to see. Tracers streak into the dark, brief orange lines that vanish as quickly as they appear. Then flak returns, heavier now, as if the gunners below have found the range of the bomber stream. A burst detonates close to the right wing. The aircraft shudders. Something clangs against the fuselage. Red's headset fills with overlapping voices. Hit where hydraulic pressure, check it Jesus. Keep it steady. Red scans his gauges. Hydraulics are holding. Fuel pressure stable. But the vibration feels different. Like a tooth, slightly loose. He forces his voice steady. "We're okay. I'm not seeing a leak." Jim exhales through clenched teeth. "Get us out of here." But out of here is not simple. They're flying through the edge of a disaster that keeps expanding. The smoke column rises higher, spreads wider. It begins to blur the horizon, turning the world into a glowing fog. Sato's voice comes again, calm as ever. "We need to climb back to cruise altitude once we clear the target area." But the turbulence is getting worse. He doesn't say why it's getting worse. But everyone feels it. The fire is pulling air inward along the ground, then blasting it upward in the center. A giant chimney, a living engine. Down below, the city's wooden districts ignite faster than any firefighter can contain. Incendiaries burst through roofs, spill into attics, catch on beams. Small fires become big ones. big ones merge. The wind that feeds them becomes stronger. In the cockpit, Jim glances down toward the inferno, and for a moment, the hardened pilot looks like a man seeing something he can't file neatly into mission accomplished. The flight path takes them along the outer edge of Tokyo's burning wards. Red can see canals and rivers shining like black ribbons cutting through orange. He can see bridges outlined in firelight. He can see areas where the flames are still separate, still survivable, then watch as they connect like nerves firing. A voice from the radio operator, low and strained. "We're getting reports. The whole aiming box is burning." Jim doesn't answer. There's nothing to say. This is what the planners wanted. Widespread fires started across a broad area, meant to overwhelm, but no one in the cockpit can pretend they're witnessing a simple target destruction anymore. This is not one factory hit. This is a city's living tissue caught in a flame. And the worst part is how quickly it's happening. The fire's brightness intensifies again, and the turbulence surges. Lady Marian lifts abruptly, the nose rising as if an invisible wave has struck them from beneath. Jim shoves the yoke forward to keep from stalling. Hold her, Red mutters. Then, without warning, the cockpit fills with a new smell, burnt wood and something sharper, carried up by the convecting air. The navigator's light flickers. Smoke creeps along the edges of the canopy like mist. They are not in the fire, but the fire has reached them. "Climb," Jim says. "Now." Red watches the engines strain as Jim increases power. The B-29 begins to nose upward, pushing toward thinner air where the turbulence might ease. But climbing means exposing themselves longer to searchlights and flak, rising into the bands where gunners have preset their fuses for aircraft trying to escape. Searchlights sweep again. One beam catches the belly of a bomber ahead, illuminating its underside in a harsh, almost surgical glare. Another beam joins it. Then another. The aircraft becomes a target pinned to the sky. Flak blossoms around it, tight and accurate. For a heartbeat, it holds together. Then it breaks, first a flash, then a trailing spark, then a larger bloom that turns into a falling comet of burning fuel and metal. No one speaks. The crew stares into the night. Red's hands hover over his panel. Useless. He wants to believe he can fix everything with switches and valves. But this isn't a mechanical failure. This is gravity and fire and war. Lady Marian continues climbing, and the higher they go, the wider the view becomes. Tokyo's fire spreads outward, forming a ragged, bright mass that fills the horizon. The smoke plume rises and spreads like a giant hand reaching into the stratosphere. From this vantage, you can see smaller fires igniting in other districts, secondary blazes sparked by wind-driven embers. The city is throwing burning pieces of itself into the air. Sato's voice is quieter now. That's a firestorm forming. A firestorm is not just many fires. It is a system, a self-feeding weather event. Air rushes in at ground level, creating gale-force winds that fan flames and drag people, debris, and oxygen toward the center. Heat rises with violent force. The fire becomes its own engine. You don't have to know the scientific term to understand it. You can see it in the way the smoke column tightens, in the way the flames seem to pulse as if breathing, in the way the turbulence knocks at the bomber, even at climbing altitude. Red glances at Jim. They're not going to put that out. Jim's jaw flexes. No. The climb continues, and with it the eerie transformation the higher they go. The less it looks like a city, and the more it looks like a continent of flame. Somewhere inside that glow are homes, shelters, factories, hospitals, schools, things that were not meant to be turned into landmarks visible from miles away. The crew's training tells them to focus on survival and navigation. But the human part of them, the part that still sees people as people, keeps looking down. The Japanese commanders who will receive the reports later will not see Red O'Hara's hands shaking on a panel. They won't hear Jim McKenna's strained breathing or Sato's quiet words. They'll see numbers and maps and damage assessments. But tonight, in the sky over their capital, The truth is unavoidable. Tokyo is burning so bright that the bomber crews no longer need instruments to find their way. They just follow the light. By the time Lady Marian levels off again, the altimeter reads higher, the air colder. But the cockpit feels no relief. The glow behind them still stains the sky, a horizon-wide orange that refuses to shrink, even at altitude. The turbulence lingers, faint tremors in the controls, the lingering breath of the fire's updrafts. Red checks the engines again. Number 3 cools slightly, but the needle never settles into the comfortable band it would have at 30,000 feet. The superfortress is flying, but it's flying through a world that has changed. Below, Tokyo's smoke column climbs like a second mountain. In places it looks almost solid, a black pillar boiling upward, lit from beneath by the city itself. Jim finally speaks into the intercom, voice low, status check. Each station answers with the same clipped discipline men use to keep emotion out of their mouths. Navigator okay. Bombardier okay. Radio okay. Tail okay. Engineer okay. Okay does not mean fine, it means alive. The bomber stream stretches into the distance like a procession aircraft at different altitudes now. Some climbing, some still turning off their bomb runs, others limping away with wounded engines. In the darkness, you can't always tell what you're looking at until it's too late. A missing section of wing, a flickering fire, a thin trail of fuel mist. Over the radio, the traffic is sparse and tense. Short calls, damage reports, a few voices that are too calm, because calm is all they have left. Then a transmission comes in, crackling, urgent, an aircraft calling for help, reporting an engine fire. Another voice answers, telling them to ditch course south if necessary, pointing toward open water rather than trying to make the long haul back on a failing machine. The Pacific below offers no mercy, only emptiness. Red looks out the side window and catches a glimpse of something strange, tiny glowing specks drifting upward around the bomber's wingtip. For a second, he thinks it's a mechanical issue. Sparks. Some electrical failure. Then he realizes ash. Tokyo's ashes are rising high enough to brush the bombers on their way out. It's a small detail, almost delicate, and it makes his stomach turn. Tokyo below, a city becoming a furnace. Down on the ground, the situation has already slipped beyond any ordinary definition of air raid. The incendiaries don't just ignite, they multiply. They find wood, paper, cloth, oil, stored fuel, stacked lumber, shop inventories, everything that keeps a city alive. Fire crews attempt to respond, but water lines rupture, hydrants fail, roads clog with debris and fleeing families, embers blow horizontally, igniting blocks that were still intact minutes earlier. The wind created by the fire does what wind always does. Except, now it is cruelly purposeful. It pushes the flames forward like a living front. From above, the movement is visible. The fire doesn't spread randomly. It surges, streams, merge, like a tide. Red thinks of the word Sato used system. That's what makes it terrifying. A system doesn't care about individual suffering. It feeds. The Japanese perspective reports that don't make sense. In Tokyo, even before dawn, messages begin pouring toward command channels, fragmented reports from civil defense units, police stations, military district offices, at Imperial General Headquarters and in associated command structures responsible for air defense officers begin to receive information that doesn't fit their expectations. They are used to raids that hit specific targets, to damage that can be charted in circles and rectangles. This is different. The reports are too big, too fast. A staff officer reads one message, then reads it again, as if the words might change. Entire wards, burning uncontrollably. Another officer reports that communications lines have failed in multiple districts. A third notes that emergency services are overwhelmed and that fires are merging into one continuous blaze. Someone asks the kind of question people ask when the world is breaking: how many aircraft? No one has a confident answer. The raid is coming in waves. The radar and observers have difficulty tracking low-altitude night intruders in such numbers. Anti-aircraft batteries fire. Searchlights sweep. But the city's smoke and the bomber stream's dispersal makes the defense feel clumsy. Late. Somewhere in that command environment, whether in an operations room lit by shaded lamps or a headquarters corridor smelling of ink and sweat, a Japanese officer realizes something that is both tactical and psychological. They are not facing a single raid. They are facing a method. One switch, the tactical shift that made it possible. From the American side, the change seems deceptively simple when written on paper: lower altitude, nighttime approach, incendiary emphasis, reduced defensive gun weight. But in practice, it is an entire reconfiguration of how the B-29 war is being fought. At high altitude, the bomber crews battled winds so strong they could throw bomb patterns miles off target. At high altitude, clouds masked aiming points. At high altitude, precision was an idea that could collapse into scattered impacts and disappointing results. LeMay's choice to go low is like flipping a switch from surgical to systemic. Down low, winds are lighter. The incendiaries land closer to where they're intended. Fire spreads across contiguous neighborhoods rather than isolated points. The payload is not meant to smash a single building, it is meant to ignite thousands. The Japanese commanders, reading the first coherent assessments, begin to understand the implications. If the Americans can do this once, they can do it again. If they can do it again, then Japan's urban vulnerability is not a temporary crisis. It is a fatal condition. The return flight quiet men and loud engines. Lady Marian turns southeast over the ocean. The glow of Tokyo remains behind them for a long time, shrinking slowly, stubbornly, like the last light of a dying sun. Only when the horizon darkens back into normal night does the crew's breathing change. The men don't cheer. They don't joke. The adrenaline doesn't drain neatly, it clings. Jim speaks again. Softer now. Keep an eye on that engine temp. Red nodes. Though Jim can't see it, he continues monitoring, making small adjustments, listening for changes in vibration that might signal damage. In the quiet, someone in the cockpit finally says what everyone has been thinking but no one has wanted to speak into existence. Did you ever think we'd see something like that? No one answers immediately. Then Sato, voice measured, replies, no. A pause. And the worst part, he adds, is they'll call it successful. The word hangs there, successful, and suddenly it feels like a word that doesn't belong to human language. Over the radio, more reports filter in. Aircraft lost. Aircraft damaged. Crews missing. The cost is not abstract to Red. He has friends on other planes. Faces he can picture under flight helmets. Men he ate with and cursed with and listened to complain about engines. Now they are coordinates over water. Or not even that. Hours later, as dawn begins to smear pale grey across the Pacific, the bomber stream limps home. The Mariana Islands appear like dark shapes on the horizon. North Field comes into view again, runways carved into coral. The same floodlights. The same ground crews waiting. Lady Marian drops her landing gear. The aircraft thumps onto the runway. Tires screeching. The engines roar down to idle. When the props finally slow, the silence is almost painful. Red climbs down the ladder into the warm morning air and turns instinctively to look back east toward Japan. Toward Tokyo. He can't see the city anymore, only sky. But he can still smell smoke in his clothes. Faint and stubborn, as if the fire has followed him across the ocean. And far away, in Tokyo's command channels, the scale of the night is becoming undeniable, block after block, ward after ward. Communications collapsing under the weight of a catastrophe too large to contain. For Japanese commanders, the question is no longer whether the Americans can reach Tokyo. The question is, what kind of Tokyo will remain when they come back? March 10th. Incendiary, Tokyo. Just before dawn. The smoke is so thick, it turns street lamps into pale ghosts. In some districts, the night never truly ends. Flames still burn with a steady, hungry roar, and the sky above the city is stained a dull, bruised orange. The wind keeps moving, but it doesn't feel like ordinary weather. It feels like the city is inhaling and exhaling through fire. In pockets where structures still stand, people stumble out of shelters and alleys, faces blackened with soot, clothes stiff with ash. The roads are clogged with carts, bicycles, and families carrying bundles that look too small to hold a life's worth of possessions. A mother clutches a child whose eyes are wide and unblinking. An older man holds a framed photograph like it's a compass. Along canals and rivers, crowds gather at the edges, some seeking water, some seeking open space, some simply trapped by the heat and the crush of bodies behind them. Police whistles shriek and vanish under the roar. The city's emergency services, already strained by years of war and shortages, are overwhelmed. Fire brigades move where they can, but equipment fails. Hose rupture, and streets turn into impassable corridors of debris. In many areas, the fire has already done what firestorms do. It has consumed and moved on, leaving behind a landscape that feels unreal in the half-light. Tokyo's commanders try to count the uncountable. At the administrative and military levels, the first daylight assessments begin. Observers reach rooftops and surviving office blocks to look outward. What they see doesn't fit the mental categories of raid damage. A raid damages targets. This has transformed the city. Maps are unrolled. Reports are stacked. Telephone lines crackle with partial connections and sudden dead air. An officer in an operations room points at a district on the map and tries to draw a boundary around affected area. He keeps expanding the circle. Then he stops and simply stares. Because the boundary is not a circle. It's a wound that sprawls. Somewhere in the chain of command, a senior officer asks for a number. How much burned? The answer comes back haltingly, revised as it's spoken. It's not one factory. It's not one dockyard. It's not even one ward. It is a vast portion of the capital. And then the most crushing detail arrives, the nature of it. Not high explosive craters. Not collapsed concrete. It's mostly gone because it was mostly wood. The fire didn't need to shatter buildings to remove them. It only needed time and wind. This is the moment when the raid becomes more than destruction. It becomes a revelation, a realization that Japanese civil defense is not merely inadequate, it is structurally helpless against this method. The Americans have discovered a way to turn Japan's urban construction into a vulnerability too large to defend. Back on Tinian, the quiet after the roar. At Northfield, dawn brings a different kind of chaos. Crews returning, aircraft rolling in with patched holes, scorched paint, and shrapnel dents. Ambulances wait near the runway. Ground crew chiefs count planes as they appear through the early haze. Lady Marion taxis in, and Red watches the maintenance team swarming the aircraft. A crewman points at a flak hole near the wing, root clean-edged, as if punched with a tool. Someone else inspects a control surface, running fingers over the torn metal. Red steps away from the bustle and finds a place where he can breathe without hearing engines. He looks down at his hands. They're trembling, not from fear now, but from the delayed shock of having lived through something he didn't fully understand while it was happening. Jim appears beside him, removing his flight gloves slowly, as if each finger has its own weight. They'll ask how it went. Jim says. Red nods. They'll want numbers. Jim doesn't smile. And we'll give them numbers. Across the field, crews trade fragments of what they saw. Bright as day. Smoke above us. Updrafts nearly flipped us. I saw one go down, couldn't do a thing. There's a particular way airmen talk after a mission like this, short sentences. No wasted emotion. If they let themselves speak too long, something inside might break. Inside the debriefing rooms, Officers collect details, altitudes, flak intensity, fighter sightings, bomb release times. They mark maps and fill forms. And then the evaluations begin. The photographs will come later, recon images, damage analysis, before and after comparisons. But some conclusions are immediate. The low-altitude approach worked. The winds didn't scatter the pattern. The incendiaries started fires at the density planners wanted. The fires merged exactly as predicted, perhaps even faster. The words "highly effective" appear in reports. Red hears someone say it and feels a coldness in his chest. The switch from above strategy, becoming certainty. In the weeks leading up to March 1945, the B-29 campaign had been wrestling with a difficult truth. High-altitude precision bombing over Japan was not producing the desired results. Weather, cloud cover, and jet stream winds made accuracy inconsistent. Mechanical problems, engine fires, and long overwater flights made each sortie expensive in men and machines. LeMay's tactical shift night. Low altitude. Incendiaries represents a kind of strategic surrender to reality. If the Americans can't consistently hit a single factory at high altitude, they can reliably destroy the industrial web by burning the city that houses it. It's brutal logic, but it is logic. For Japanese commanders, the realization is equally brutal. Their air defenses and civil defense systems are not designed for this scale. Anti-aircraft guns can damage bombers, but they cannot stop hundreds from arriving. Fighters can catch some, but not enough. Fire breaks are limited. Water pressure fails. Roads choke, and a firestorm turns every human response into something too small. When those commanders hear the phrase, "low-level night incendiary raid," they now understand it isn't a one-off improvisation. It is a blueprint. And once a blueprint exists, it can be repeated. The human weight of success. Back on Tinian. Red tries to sleep. He lies on his cot, staring at the underside of a bunk above him. The tent canvas flutters in the breeze. Somewhere outside. Engines start again, other aircraft preparing for other missions. Because the war does not pause for reflection. He closes his eyes and sees the city again, glowing like a continent. He hears the words from the cockpit, "It's making its own weather." He thinks about the ash drifting up to the bomber stream, Tokyo's remains, brushing the wings of American aircraft. He doesn't know the exact scale of what happened yet. He doesn't know the numbers that historians will use later, but he knows what it felt like to fly above it. And he knows, with a kind of sick certainty, that the planners will look at the results and come to one conclusion: do it again. In Tokyo, the surviving officials and commanders come to a different conclusion. There may not be a way to stop it. For the first time, the capital has been treated not as a symbol but as a target that can be systematically erased. And when commanders grasp that truth fully, in daylight, with smoke still rising, they do not feel confusion anymore. They feel something colder, stunned silence, because the one switch wasn't a mechanical trick. It was the moment the air war over Japan changed from difficult to inevitable. March 10th. Itenjobai Sushiwu, Tokyo Air Defense Headquarters. Morning light. The building is still standing. But the world outside the windows looks like it belongs to another planet. Smoke drifts across the city in layered curtains. The sun, when it appears, is weak and coppery, filtered through soot. Inside the operations rooms, officers speak in low voices over maps that are already smeared with fingerprints and ash. Couriers arrive with handwritten notes. Telephone lines work intermittently, ringing, connecting, then dying. Radios bring in fragments from observation posts and surviving police boxes, fire spreading. Roads impassable. Water pressure failing. People moving toward the river. A senior officer, collar crisp, eyes bloodshot, leans over a table where a junior staff member is trying to build a coherent picture from chaos. How many aircraft? The senior officer asks again. The junior officer hesitates, then gives the best estimate available. It is a number that sounds impossible when spoken out loud. Hundreds. How low the senior officer presses. Low level. Comes the answer. Night approach. Incendiaries. The senior officer's face tightens not with anger, but with the strain of recognizing a pattern. At high altitude, Japan's defenses at least had a script radar track. Scramble. Barrage. Searchlights. At low altitude. At night. In a stream. The raid becomes something else entirely. A flood. Someone brings in a report describing the marker fires, how the first blazes appeared in a planned shape, how the main waves followed, how the target area ignited in a way that seemed almost prearranged. The report doesn't use the word blueprint, but that's what it describes. Now the commanders have to do something worse than fight it. They have to explain it. The imperial city that could be reached at will. Tokyo is not just a city, it is the nerve center of government, industry, and symbol. For months, there had been an assumption never spoken too loudly, but present that the capital's importance and its defenses created a kind of psychological shield. But the night of March 9/10 has stripped that away. An officer points to a map showing the burned area an uneven, sprawling scar. A colleague tries to mark critical facilities within it. But the marks become meaningless because the very idea of separating civil and industrial in Tokyo's layout collapses under the evidence. Workshops and homes, storage sheds and schools, small factories and family kitchens woven together in flammable density. The phrase that keeps surfacing is not a doctrine, it is a confession. We could not stop them. In the chain of command, that confession has consequences. If Tokyo can be burned on command, then other cities can follow. If other cities follow, then the nation's ability to continue the war industrial output, transportation, morale will erode faster than any battlefield casualty list can capture. For Japanese commanders, the terror isn't only what happened, it's what the method implies. The civil defense illusion breaks. Messages from civil defense authorities paint a grim picture: fire brigades outmatched, equipment insufficient, roads clogged, evacuation routes failing under sheer volume, even where courage exists. Organization fails against scale. Some neighborhoods attempt fire breaks, demolishing buildings to stop flame fronts, but the winds and ember showers leap gaps that would normally work. In places, the fire doesn't behave like separate blazes. It behaves like a tide. One officer, older, experienced, mentions the term conflagration, but the younger men have already seen enough to use a harsher word: hellscape. They don't say it aloud in front of superiors, but you can see it in their faces as they study maps that no longer represent streets, only burned zones and surviving islands. And then comes a detail that crystallizes the helplessness: reports that the raid's intensity created winds that made movement difficult, that fed the flames, that turned the city itself into a machine. A commander hears this and goes very still, because if the attack creates its own weather, then defending against it is not just a matter of guns and hoses, it is a matter of physics. On the other side of the ocean, a different kind of certainty. Tinian. Later that day, in American briefing rooms, the talk is technical. Officers discuss altitudes, wind layers, and bomb patterns. They compare notes from multiple crews. They take the chaos of lived experience and translate it into procedures. Major General LeMay's staff gathers what they need, evidence that the tactic worked. Reconnaissance will later confirm what crews already sensed from the sky: vast areas burned, industrial output disrupted, and the city's structure exploited with ruthless efficiency. The planners had not needed to guess Tokyo would burn. They had studied its vulnerabilities. Now they validated them. In that process, a war changes shape. It becomes repeatable. For the aircrews, that repeatability is its own burden. Red hears a rumor near the mess line more low-level incendiary missions are being considered. Another man says he heard they'll hit other cities: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, names that are now less geography and more future glow on a horizon. Red doesn't argue. He has no authority here. He is a small gear inside a very large machine. But he also knows what repeatable means. It means more nights like the last one, more smoke reaching the cockpit, more aircraft caught in searchlights, more friends missing at roll call. The stunned moment becomes a doctrine. Back in Tokyo, commanders begin preparing defenses for a threat that is fundamentally different from what they prepared for in 1944. They can shuffle anti-aircraft guns. They can increase night patrols. They can improve blackout discipline. But none of those things can guarantee that hundreds of bombers won't arrive again. Worse, they now understand the psychological element. The American crews no longer need perfect weather for precision. They need only a night, a route, and incendiaries. The stunned silence of the morning hardens into a grim acceptance among Japan's leadership. The home front is no longer a distant backdrop. It is now a battlefield that can be entered from the sky at will. An officer, standing over a map, quietly says to another, "If this continues, how many cities can endure?" No one answers him, because everyone in the room already knows the answer they fear. And out over the Pacific, as engines are serviced and bomb bays prepared again, the bomber crews of the XXI Bomber Command begin to realize the same thing from the opposite direction. That one switch was not a single night's decision. It was the start of a new phase of war, one that would return to Japan's cities again and again, until the country's leaders faced a question no defense plan could fully solve. March 11th. Itenjobai Sushawu, Northfield, Tinian. The airfield wakes before sunrise. Not because anyone is rested, but because the war's schedule doesn't care about sleep. Generators hum. Trucks rattle over coral. A distant engine test run shakes the ground like a low earthquake. Red O'Hara stands near Lady Marion with a mug of bitter coffee, watching maintenance crews crawl over the aircraft with flashlights, even though daylight is coming. The men work with the steady confidence of people who fix what can be fixed. Patches go on. Panels come off. A checklist becomes a promise we can make her fly again. But among the flight crews, something has shifted. They are not talking about Tokyo the way they talked about Truk or Rabble earlier in the war. Single targets, clear military objectives. Tokyo has become a word that carries a color, a heat, and a sound. In the mess line, someone says, "They're calling it Meetinghouse." Another crewman replies, "Sounds like Sunday school. Didn't look like it." The laughter is brief and thin. It evaporates under the weight of what they remember. Inside a briefing room later that day, officers begin doing what officers do, turning human experience into operational language. A blackboard fills with headings: altitudes, routes, timing windows, navigation procedures, gun configuration notes, incendiary loadouts. The raid is becoming a template. A junior officer points to a map of Japan and circles other urban areas. He doesn't speak dramatically, but the room reacts anyway, because everyone understands what circles mean now. Not targets, cities. LeMay's staff, cool and methodical, refines the logic. Low altitude reduced wind dispersal. Night lowered the risk from high-altitude fighters and improved the chances of reaching aiming areas under cloud cover. Incendiaries exploited urban construction and the interwoven nature of small industry. The method worked. Red watches from the back of the room, feeling like he's listening to strangers describe a different event than the one he lived. The language is clean. It is designed to be repeated. After the briefing, Red steps outside and looks across the flight line. A fresh set of bomb carts sits under canvas. Ordnance crews are already preparing. Somewhere a B-29's engines cough to life, and the sound triggers a reflex in his chest, an instinctive tightening. Jim McKenna finds him near the revetment wall. Both men briefly alone. They're moving fast. Jim says. Red nods. It's like they don't want to leave room for thinking. Jim doesn't deny it. We're not paid to think. We're paid to fly. Red glances at him. You believe that? Jim stares out at the runway. I believe it's true. The other side of the equation. Tokyo. March 11th. The city's surviving infrastructure is a patchwork. Some roads function. Some don't. Some neighborhoods are intact islands surrounded by empty stretches where blocks used to be. Smoke still rises from hotspots that refuse to die. Officials try to restore order. Police units redirect traffic. Civil administrators attempt head counts and temporary shelters. Trains run irregularly, if at all. And the normal rhythm of Tokyo, the movement of workers. Deliveries. Commuters has been broken into fragments. But the most important work is happening indoors. Away from the ruined streets, the effort to understand what happened well enough to prevent it from happening again. In a conference room with maps spread across tables, Japanese air defense officers trace the raid's likely routes, the timing of waves, the areas of heaviest impact. They pin notes to boards. They compare witness reports with radar logs that are incomplete at low altitude. They argue over how many bombers were truly present and how many were multiple sightings of the same aircraft in different sectors. One man points at the concept of low-level night approach and says, quietly, "Then our warning time is shortened." Another replies, "And our interception window becomes smaller." A third officer, older, stiff-backed, adds a sentence that lands like a stone. "And our city burns faster than we can respond." No one in the room disputes it. The debate is no longer about whether Tokyo burned. The debate is about whether this method can be disrupted with any realistic changes. They discuss searchlight coordination. They discuss better distribution of anti-aircraft fire. They discuss dispersal, moving critical production out of urban areas. They discuss evacuation procedures. But beneath all those practical conversations is a harder truth. Japan's material situation in 1945 is not improving. Fuel is scarce. Replacement parts are scarce. Trained pilots are fewer than they once were. Radar coverage is limited and can be jammed or avoided. And even if they did everything perfectly, the attacker has a simple advantage. The attacker chooses the time. That's what stuns the commanders most, not only the scale of destruction, but the control implied by it. If the Americans can fly from the Marianas, arrive at night, and ignite a city in hours, then Japan's leadership is being forced into reacting rather than shaping. A commander rubs a hand across his face and says, "If they do this to other cities." He doesn't finish the sentence, because finishing it would mean acknowledging that what happened to Tokyo could happen to Japan itself. Piece by piece. The viewers seat in the cockpit. Back on Tinian, Red sits with his crew in a quiet corner near the tent line. Away from the bustle. The men clean equipment. Check parachute harnesses. Sharpen small habits into something they can control. Tommy Wells, the bombardier, stares at his hands. "I can still feel the doors opening," he says suddenly. The others look at him. He continues. Voice distant. It's like the whole airplane took a breath. Sato, normally composed, nods once. It did. You can imagine sitting there with them, feeling the same contradiction that hangs in the air. They survived. They did their jobs. And yet the memory doesn't settle into a neat story of victory or sacrifice. It sits like a weight because it isn't about a single enemy formation shot down or a bunker destroyed. It's about a city becoming light. Jim finally breaks the silence. Next time, they'll expect the same results. Red looks up, and if they don't get them, Jim's expression hardens. They'll adjust until they do. That's the second map. No one wants to draw the map of what comes next. Not just the burned districts of Tokyo, but the circles around other cities, the routes that will be flown again, the procedures that will be repeated until they feel routine. Routine is the most dangerous word in a war like this, because once something becomes routine, it stops being questioned. And somewhere across the ocean, Japanese commanders are drawing their own second map, the one that asks not how to defend Tokyo, but how to defend Japan's cities at all. Two sets of men, separated by thousands of miles, are reaching the same grim realization from opposite directions. The air war has become a system, and systems don't stop unless something breaks them. Late March 1945. Mariana Islands. The shift is no longer theoretical. It's in the way the airfield moves. Incendiary bomb carts roll out more often. Briefings focus on route timing, low-altitude navigation, and what to do when smoke rises to meet the aircraft. Crews learn to recognize the feel of fire-generated turbulence, the way they once learned to recognize flak patterns. The war is teaching them new instincts. Red O'Hara notices it first in the small changes, the lack of surprise in men's faces when low level is mentioned. The way a pilot's hands settle on the yoke with a resigned steadiness. The way gunners complain less about missing ammunition belts because there are fewer guns to feed now. Not everyone likes it, but dislike is not a factor the system measures. On one afternoon, Red stands under the wing of Lady Marian as the maintenance chief points at a repaired panel. Good as new, the chief says. Red doesn't correct him. Nothing is new, not after Tokyo. Jim McKenna receives the next mission order with a single nod. He reads the route notes, folds them, and slides them into his jacket like it's any other flight. Sato checks charts and headings. Tommy rechecks his release procedures. The radio operator tests frequencies. The tail gunner jokes once something thin and bitter then goes quiet. This is how patterns begin, not with drama, with repetition. Japan watches the pattern form. Japan. March 1945. The word spreads through Japanese military channels in the way bad news always does, first as whispers, then as hard, undeniable reality. Tokyo was not a fluke. It was not a singular horror meant only for the capital. Other cities begin experiencing raids that feel eerily familiar night approaches. Incendiary emphasis. Fires that spread too quickly for response. Japanese commanders attempt adaptations. Anti-aircraft units shift deployment. Searchlight batteries adjust coordination. Local civil defense drills intensify. But every adjustment is reactive. And each raid tests the adjustments like a blade tests armor. The greatest problem is not courage or will. It is time and resources. Japan's industrial base is under strain. Fuel is scarce. Replacement aircraft are scarce. Trained crews are scarce. Radar coverage is limited and challenged. Even when interceptors get airborne, finding bombers at night amid smoke and fires is an uneven contest. And as the raids continue, a realization sinks deeper. The Americans have discovered a method that does not require perfect conditions to be devastating. Bad weather no longer saves a city. Clouds no longer hide it. Wind no longer scatters the attack. The night itself, once protective, becomes a cloak for an oncoming fire. The crew's human math. On Tinian, the bomber crews start doing their own calculations. Not on maps, but in their heads. How long does it take to reach Japan? How long over target? How long back? How many engines can you lose and still fly? How thick can smoke get before it chokes the engines? How close can flak come before the airframe starts to feel soft? Red hears the older flight engineers compare notes like mechanics and gamblers at the same time. Keep the cowl flaps ready. Low-level heat builds fast. Watch number 3. Those R3350s don't forgive you. If you smell smoke in the cockpit, you're already closer than you think. It's a language of survival. At night, in the barracks, Red lies awake listening to distant engines. The sound is constant, like a heart beating somewhere outside the walls. It reminds him that no matter what he feels, schedules will be met. He remembers the ash drifting near the wingtip. He remembers the aircraft caught in searchlights. He remembers the falling comet of burning metal. He also remembers something else, the way Tokyo's glow made navigation almost unnecessary. That detail returns to him in a strange way, like a warning. When a target becomes bright enough to guide you, the line between operation and inevitability starts to blur. A Japanese officer's private moment. In Tokyo, an air defense officer mid-level, exhausted, uniform wrinkled, steps out of a meeting room and into a corridor. He leans against a wall and closes his eyes for a second. He can still smell smoke in the city air days later. He can still taste ash. Inside the meeting room, they speak in controlled phrases about disposition of batteries, fighter readiness, early warning. But in the corridor, alone, the officer thinks about something simpler. He thinks about homes. He thinks about how quickly a neighborhood becomes a fire. He thinks about how the Americans did not need to land troops in Tokyo to transform it. They only needed a route, a night, and an idea. The officer opens his eyes and looks down the corridor at other men in uniform, moving briskly between rooms. Everyone is pretending speed equals control. But the officer knows speed can also be panic dressed up as competence. He returns to the meeting because he has to, and because in war, private dread is a luxury. Back to the flight line. Another mission night arrives. Another row of B-29s starts their engines. Another set of crews climbs into cockpits. Another set of bomb bay doors will open over Japan. Red sits at his panel and runs his checks. Hands moving automatically. Fuel boost pumps on. Cowl flap set. Oil pressure steady. Jim's voice comes through. Steady as stone. Ready. Red hesitates just a fraction before answering. Ready. And in that fraction of hesitation is everything human left in the system, a small space where a man still remembers what he's about to do. The props blur. The runway lights streak. The aircraft lifts into darkness. From above the Pacific, Japan is still far away. For now, the night is empty again. But it won't stay empty, because the pattern has been set. And in Tokyo, Japanese commanders wait for the next glow on the horizon, knowing now that it may come not as a surprise, but as a scheduled event. The night, once a shield, has become a corridor. Early April 1945, Guam. XXI Bomber Command Headquarters. The room smells like damp paper, cigarette smoke, and sweat that never quite leaves wool uniforms in the tropics. Ceiling fans push warm air in slow circles above tables covered in maps and reconnaissance prints. This is where a night of fire becomes columns of figures. A young intelligence officer lays out aerial photographs, black and white frames taken from high altitude after the raid. At first glance, they look like cloud patterns. Then the eye adjusts, and you see what's missing: blocks, street grids, the ordinary texture of a city. In its place are vast, pale areas where structures are simply gone. A colonel leans in, tapping a finger near the edge of one photo. That's a ward boundary. The intelligence officer checks his notes. Yes, sir. And beyond it, the colonel exhales. He is not emotional. Not in the way the crews were emotional in the cockpit. His reaction is colder. It's the recognition that the tactic didn't just work. It worked at a scale that will now shape policy. Across the room, another officer holds a report summarizing the mission's effectiveness in careful, controlled phrasing. The language is professional and antiseptic, but the meaning is blunt. The method created destruction beyond what high-altitude precision raids had been reliably producing. LeMay's staff absorbs this without surprise. They were betting on it. But even they go quiet when the final assessments land, not because they're shocked by what they wanted, but because the results are too large to treat casually. A staff officer asks, "Losses?" The answer is read out with the same flat tone as everything else: aircraft missing, aircraft damaged, crews lost or unaccounted for. The numbers are not small, and they never are. Yet the room reacts more strongly to the damage figures than to the losses, because the machine is built to do that. Then a clerk steps forward with a fresh sheet, an estimate that will be refined, debated, argued over, and recorded. It is the kind of number that becomes history. The colonel looks at it again, as if it might change. He sets it down slowly, and in that moment, you can feel something tightening across the whole operation. The raid is no longer an experiment. It is proof. Back on Tinian, the crew meets the evidence. Red O'Hara hears about the assessment days later, not from an official briefing but from a rumor that travels faster than any memo. They're saying it worked better than they even expected. A crew chief says near the maintenance tents. Red doesn't ask what better means. He already knows what the glow looked like. He saw the smoke climbing like a second mountain. Still, when an official update arrives, photographs pinned to a board, Annotated maps showing the burned area, he finds himself drawn toward it like a moth to a lamp. The men gather in a loose semicircle, squinting at the images. Someone whistles under his breath. Tommy Wells, the bombardier, steps closer until his boots nearly touch the board. That's all that he says. Sato points at a canal line faintly visible, a dark thread through the pale scar. That's where the river should be, he murmurs, more to himself than anyone else. Jim McKenna doesn't speak. He studies the map as if it's a flight plan. But Red can see the set of his jaw. This is not a route. It's a consequence. A junior officer standing nearby tries to keep the tone upbeat, the way morale briefings do. This is what happens when you find the right altitude and the right load. The officer says. Red hears it and feels something tighten in his stomach. The officer is not wrong in the technical sense, but it sounds like talking about a machine adjustment, like changing a carburetor jet. The crew disperses slowly. No one lingers too long. Looking at the photos is like looking at a mirror that shows you something you can't take back. In Tokyo, commanders stare at the same shape. Tokyo, same week. The Japanese side is doing the same thing with different tools, maps on tables. Reports stacked in neat piles. Surviving officials trying to describe a wound that sprawls beyond the words they were trained to use. A senior officer in an air defense meeting points at a burn map and says, "This is not localized damage." No one argues. The problem is no longer diagnosis, it's prognosis. The officer asks for the same things LeMay's staff asks for: timing, routes, altitudes, tactics, and the answers come back with uncomfortable clarity. Low level, night, incendiary concentration, marker fires, guiding waves. A younger officer suggests strengthening fighter patrols. Another suggests spreading anti-aircraft guns differently. Someone mentions the need to disperse industry further out. An older commander listens. Then says quietly, "Even if we do all of that, they can still come." The room goes still because everyone understands what he means. The Americans have geographic advantage now, bases close enough to reach Japan regularly, aircraft with range enough to carry heavy loads, and the ability to choose nights when defenses are tired and resources thin. Japan's commanders are forced into a terrible kind of planning, not how to prevent raids entirely, but how to reduce the damage of the next one, knowing that reduce might still mean catastrophe. And beneath every line of that planning is a fear no one wants to voice. If Tokyo can burn like that, then the country's emotional center can be turned into ash again at any time. A private conversation in a public war. Back on Tinian. Red finds Jim outside the tent line after dinner, both men staring at the runway lights in the distance. Jim speaks first, voice low. "Those photos?" Red nods. "Yeah." Jim's eyes don't move. "You ever think about what it looks like from their side?" Red hesitates. "I try not to." Jim finally turns his head slightly. "Me too." They stand in silence. The engines in the distance start up again, one by one, turning the night into a familiar vibration. Around them, men move with purpose, checking gear, writing quick letters, lighting cigarettes, laughing too loudly at jokes that aren't funny. Routine is back, trying to wrap itself around the unroutine thing they did. Red watches the first B-29 roll toward the runway and feels the same dread he felt before Tokyo, except now it's sharpened by knowledge. Now he has seen what right altitude and right load can mean. A crewman jogs past, calling out to someone. A ground crew chief raises a hand signal. The aircraft's engines roar louder. Jim says, almost to himself, "They're going to keep turning that switch." Red answers without thinking, the truth coming out like breath, until something makes them stop. The B-29 lifts into the dark, climbing over the Pacific, and on the far side of that ocean, Japanese commanders wait, reading maps, counting guns, rationing fuel, planning for a method that has already proved it can remake a city in a single night. May 1945. Tokyo. After midnight, the city is quieter now, not peaceful, just trained. The blackout rules are stricter. Windows are covered. Streets that once glowed with small civilian life are dim corridors where footsteps sound louder than they should. A civil defense warden stands at the edge of a narrow lane, helmet slightly too large, whistle hanging from his neck. He listens. Not for sirens. Sirens come late sometimes, tangled in broken communications and uncertainty. He listens for something older and more reliable, the low, distant rumble that doesn't belong to thunder. Engines. Since March, Tokyo has learned to fear the sound of aircraft in a new way. Not a single bomber passing high overhead, not a brief raid that ends quickly. A stream. The warden tilts his head, trying to decide if what he hears is imagination or reality. The air is humid. The smell of smoke still feels embedded in the city, as if the ground itself remembers. Somewhere, far above the clouds, a formation is coming. Over the Pacific, the routine tightens. Tinian. Same night. Lady Marian is back in the air again. Not necessarily toward Tokyo this time. Routes change. Targets change. The map is wider now, but the method feels familiar enough that the men can predict the rhythm of it. Red O'Hara watches the gauges with the calm of habit. He hates that calm. He hates how his hands move without thought. Jim McKenna keeps his voice even. Altitude check. Sato answers with numbers that slide into place like puzzle pieces. Tommy Wells prepares his release timing. Eyes narrowed. The same concentration as always, but with a new hardness around it, less wonder, more inevitability. The radio operator catches short transmissions. Some are routine, some are grim. An aircraft aborting, another reporting flak damage, another requesting a heading correction. The bomber stream stretches into the night like a long chain disappearing into darkness. Red glances out. The moon is faint, filtered by thin cloud. The Pacific looks calm, indifferent. That's the strange thing. The most massive events in human war are carried across a surface that doesn't care. And then, as Japan nears, the air changes again. The horizon becomes something other than empty. Jim speaks quietly. You smell it. Red pauses, then realizes what he means. Not smoke this time. Not yet. Something else land. Humidity. The faintest trace of a country beneath the clouds. They are close enough now that the war stops feeling like an operation and starts feeling like trespass. The Japanese commander's new reality. Tokyo. War rooms. Night shift. The officers responsible for air defense no longer ask if the Americans will come. They ask when, where, and how many. Those are the questions of someone who has accepted the attacker's initiative. Maps are updated constantly. Battery positions are marked and remarked. Searchlight schedules are adjusted. Fighter readiness is discussed in the blunt language of scarcity. How much fuel? How many trained pilots? How many aircraft can be risked tonight and still be available tomorrow? A commander, older and sharper-eyed than most, stands over a table and watches his staff move like men trying to stop an incoming tide with buckets. He says, not loudly, their method is the weapon. A junior officer looks up. Sir. The commander taps the map with a finger. Not one bomb. Not one aircraft. The method. Night. Low altitude. Incendiaries. Repetition. The junior officer swallows. Then what do we do? The commander doesn't answer immediately. Because the honest answer is uncomfortable. They can't do much that guarantees safety. They can only increase the price the Americans pay and hope, somehow, that price changes the attacker's decisions. But hope is not a plan. On the ground, people adapt to the unadaptable. In Tokyo, families sleep in clothes they can run in. Some keep bags packed water, rice, documents, photographs. Others don't bother. Because what bag can hold a home? Neighborhood leaders practice evacuation routes to canals, to open spaces, to any place where flames might have less to feed on. People learn which streets become bottlenecks. They learn that panic is as dangerous as fire. The civil defense warden hears the sirens at last, thin and wavering in the distance. The sound travels across the city like a warning whispered too late. He blows his whistle. People move quickly. Heads down. Trained by experience rather than instruction. Some look upward as if the darkness might reveal what's coming. It doesn't. The switch is no longer a secret. Above Japan, the American crews are living inside a doctrine now. They know the logic. They know why the altitudes are chosen. They know why incendiaries are loaded. They know the risks. They know the trade greater effect for a different kind of exposure. And they know something else. Too, something that changes how a war feels when you're the one flying it. They know the enemy commanders are no longer shocked by the concept. They're shocked by the scale. That's the difference between surprise and inevitability. Surprise fades. Inevitability grows. Red hears Tommy's voice in the intercom. Steady. I have the aiming area. Jim's reply is quiet. Hold steady. The bomb bay doors open. The aircraft shudders. Red watches his engine temps. He makes small adjustments. He keeps the machine alive. Below, faint lights begin to appear, the first signs of a city trying to hide itself. Then failing. Marker fires may appear. Searchlights may stab upward. Flak may bloom like black flowers in the night. The pattern repeats. Not because the crews want it to, but because the war has found something that works. And that is what makes it terrifying from both sides. The Japanese commanders understand the method now. They can predict it. They can name it. They can plan for it. But naming something doesn't stop it. The civil defense warden in the lane hears the engine rumble grow stronger, and his stomach tightens. Because he knows what sound can lead to. He doesn't know which part of the city will be hit tonight. He only knows the sky has become a corridor. And the corridor is open again. Lady Marian turns onto its run. The horizon ahead is still dark. For now. But every man who has flown since March understands the new truth once the first fires start. The night itself will change shape. The first marker fires bloom below like bruises forming on the skin of the city, small at first. Then multiplying as other aircraft arrive and follow the same logic. Tokyo, or whatever Japanese city lies beneath this particular run, begins to reveal itself not by lights switched on, but by flame imposed from above. Searchlights snap upward. One beam misses. Another sweeps past. Then a third locks onto a bomber ahead. Flak erupts in tight patterns, black puffs that look almost slow motion from a distance, until one bursts close enough to jolt Lady Marian and remind everyone it's real. Red O'Hara braces against his panel. He can feel the vibration change as Jim McKenna makes a small correction. The B-29 is heavy again. Bomb bay doors open. Air screaming through the cavity like a living thing. Steady, Jim says, voice calm and clipped. Steady, Sato echoes, reading the wind and the route like a man reciting scripture. Tommy Wells is already there, mentally down in the aiming area. Tracking the pattern, picking the moment. His voice comes through. Measured. Approaching release. This is what war looks like when it becomes procedure, a crew turning violence into routine through discipline and repetition. Bombs away. The aircraft jolts as its load drops, incendiary clusters falling into darkness, then blossoming into points of ignition. A moment later, the glow beneath intensifies, and you can almost sense the city's air changing as the fires begin to pull oxygen toward themselves. Lady Marian banks away. Red watches the engine temps climb again and reaches for cowl flaps, making small adjustments that feel absurdly delicate against the scale of what's unfolding below. One wrong temperature spike can mean an engine fire. One engine fire over Japan can mean ditching in the Pacific. The crew's survival is still tied to tiny needles on a panel. Behind them, flames spread. Ahead of them, other bombers arrive. The system continues. And in Japanese command rooms, officers watch the same pattern appear on their tracking boards, and in frantic field reports, fires spreading. Multiple districts. Heavy raid. No one is stunned anymore by the concept. They are stunned by the persistence, the way it keeps returning. The war rooms that no longer argue about if. As 1945 moves forward, the tone in Japanese command circles changes in ways that rarely show up in heroic histories. It becomes quieter, more brittle. Discussions shift from repel the raid to reduce losses and maintain order. Because even the best air defense is not designed to stop a method that arrives in volume. At night, low, and repeatedly, a commander stands over a map and listens to a report describing another district burning. His eyes close briefly, not from fatigue, but from the effort of holding back what the report implies. The report is not only about damage, it is about certainty. If the Americans can do this whenever they choose, then the war is no longer a question of who wins the next battle. It becomes a question of how the war ends and what is left when it does. This is where commanders were stunned becomes something more complex. Stunned is a word for a moment. What happens next is longer, a grinding recognition that the sky is no longer something you can fully defend. On Tinian, the crew learns what victory costs. When Lady Marian returns hours later, the landing feels normal tires on coral, engines throttling down, ground crew rushing in, but normal is now a mask stretched over something deeper. Red climbs down from the aircraft, legs stiff, shirt damp with sweat, and realizes he's covered in ash again. Not much, just enough to notice, enough to know it rode the air upward. Jim removes his headset slowly, as if he's peeling away a layer of the night. Tommy stares at the ground. Sato writes numbers in a notebook, his handwriting neat, his mind clinging to order. In the debrief, officers ask the same questions: flak intensity, fighter sightings, release time, aiming reference. The answers are clean and professional. No one asks, what did it feel like? And yet that is what stays with them. Red hears a young lieutenant say, "This is the way to end it faster." No one challenges him, because in 1945, speed has become a moral argument of its own. End it faster. Save lives elsewhere. Force the decision. Shorten the war. It is an argument that sits heavily in the room, because no one there can fully separate truth from justification. The choice of endings. For Japan's leaders and commanders, the air war forces a narrowing corridor of options. Cities can burn. Industry can be disrupted. Transportation can be crippled. Civil order can fracture under repeated trauma. And still the war continues. Because wars often continue long after logic says they shouldn't. Driven by pride, fear, ideology, and the dread of what surrender might mean. But every low-level incendiary raid writes the same message in smoke. We can reach you. We can return. We can repeat. For American leaders, that message is meant to produce a decision. For Japanese commanders, it produces a different kind of stunned silence, not surprise, but the awareness that the old strategies are collapsing. Red doesn't know how the war will end when he stands on Tinian under a humid sky and watches another B-29 taxi out. He doesn't know what decisions are being debated in rooms he will never enter, but he feels the pressure of it, because pressure travels through systems the way smoke travels through air. It reaches the cockpit, it reaches the panel, it reaches the hands. If you could sit with him for a moment, you'd feel it too, the sensation that something has shifted beyond tactics and sorties into the realm of endings. And when a war becomes a choice of endings, the people caught inside it begin to realize a final truth. The switch that changed one night in March did not only burn Tokyo, it changed what the future could look like. Augusto Mianoa Sute Patruzech, Shichinch. Western Pacific. The air is heavy with late summer humidity, and even the sea looks tired flat. Grey-blue, stretching toward an unseen horizon. On Tinian and Guam and Saipan, the bases are still alive with the machinery of war engines tested, fuel lines checked, crews sleeping in bursts, waking to briefings, then sleeping again. But something has changed in the tone of it all. Not relief, not celebration, a kind of strained waiting like men holding their breath without knowing exactly why. Red O'Hara feels it on the flight line in the way conversations stop when someone mentions Tokyo, in the way the word end is spoken carefully, as if saying it too loudly might break it. He has flown enough missions now that the dates blur together nights of engine trouble, nights of flak, nights of smoke and glow. The method that began in March has become part of the campaign's heartbeat. It has burned itself into their muscle memory. And then, in August, news begins to travel through the base in fragments, like everything else in war at first. A rumor in a chow line, a whispered conversation outside a tent, a voice on the radio that sounds too controlled, something about a new weapon, something about Japan's leadership, something about an announcement. Red doesn't pretend to understand the high-level decisions. He's a flight engineer, not a strategist, but he understands the feeling that spreads through the men, the sensation that the war is approaching a cliff edge where the next step could be the last. In Tokyo, commanders face a different kind of stun. In Japan's leadership circles, the stunned silence of March evolves into something broader and more final. By August 1945, the country has endured months of air raids, disruption, and worsening shortages. Cities have been struck repeatedly. The home front has been turned into a battlefield in the sky's shadow. Commanders who once talked in terms of tactics now speak in terms of survival. Reports come in not just about damage, but about what damage is doing to the nation's ability to continue transportation failures, industrial paralysis, civilian exhaustion, the creeping sense that no defense plan can restore what has been lost. The psychological shield of the capital and the homeland is gone. And then comes the moment when the conversation changes, when leaders are forced to weigh not just how to fight, but whether fighting can still produce anything but ruin. The stunned silence becomes the kind that precedes a decision that cannot be undone. Back on Tinian, the crew hears the words. When the announcement finally reaches the base, when it becomes official enough that men stop whispering and start listening openly, Red is standing near Lady Marian, watching a crew chief wipe grease off his hands with a rag that's already black. A radio crackles in the background. The voice is distant, but the words land with an unreal clarity. Japan will accept terms. For a second, Red doesn't move. He hears the sentence, but his mind doesn't accept it immediately, because his life for years has been built around the assumption that tomorrow will bring another briefing. Another runway. Another night. Jim McKenna appears beside him. Face unreadable. Tommy Wells stands a few steps away, staring at nothing. Sato's posture is straight, but his eyes are slightly unfocused, as if he's seeing March again. No one cheers right away. That's what surprises Red most. Instead, there is a long, slow exhale across the airfield like a machine, finally powering down after running too hot for too long. Some men sit down where they stand. Some light cigarettes with shaking hands. Some laugh once, sharply, then stop as if embarrassed by the sound. Red looks at Lady Marian at the patched metal, the repaired panels, the scars of flak. For months, this machine has carried them into a corridor of night and brought them back. It has been both lifeline and weapon. Now, for the first time, it looks like what it always was, an aircraft on a runway. Not a fate. The switch, in retrospect. The March 9-10 raid on Tokyo Operation Meetinghouse will remain burned into memory not only because of the scale, but because it marked a turning point in method and belief. It proved something to both sides. To the Americans, that low-altitude night incendiary tactics could devastate urban industrial Japan with a grim reliability. To Japanese commanders, that the capital and the homeland could be reached, ignited, and remade in hours. That realization delivered in flame was not the only force shaping the war's end, but it was part of the tightening vice. The air campaign did not merely target factories and infrastructure. It targeted the idea that distance and defense could preserve normal life. For Red, that switch is not a diagram in a history book. It is the smell of smoke in a cockpit. It is ash drifting near a wingtip. It is the sight of a city bright enough to navigate by. It is the memory of men speaking in controlled tones while the world below became an event. The last look east. That evening, as the base settles into a strange quiet, Red walks away from the tents and finds a spot where he can see the sky without floodlights. The stars are faint, blurred by humidity, but they're there. He thinks about Tokyo, not as a target now, but as a place where people lived through a night the sky delivered. He thinks about Japanese commanders staring at maps, trying to explain the unexplainable. He thinks about the officer in a corridor, smelling smoke days later. He thinks about the civil defense warden listening for engines. He also thinks about his own crewmen who turned dials and read maps and opened bomb bay doors, trying to survive inside a system that kept demanding repetition. The war is ending, but the images are not. Jim McKenna joins him quietly. For a while, neither man speaks. Then Jim says, almost softly, "You think we'll ever stop hearing those engines?" Red doesn't answer at first. He watches the dark ocean air, the direction where Japan lies beyond the horizon. Finally he says, "Maybe, but not soon." They stand in silence. Two small figures in a war that has been fought across oceans and cities and skies, and now is finally falling quiet. In March, a switch was flipped: altitude, timing, payload, method, a tactical decision that turned into a roaring doctrine. It stunned Japanese commanders because it made the future visible in a single night, a future where the sky could return again and again. Now the future has arrived, and it looks like quiet. Not clean, not simple, not even fully happy. Just quiet. And in that quiet is the final truth of the story. The switch changed the war, but it did not erase what the war had already done.